Hi, welcome to the Bible Thinker podcast. I am your host, Chris Belmare. Today we are going to talk about one of the most controversial issues of our day, which is critical race theory. What is critical race theory? Is this something we should be worried about? And if you've been following the news at all, there's been a lot of cases where parents are going to school board meetings with this claim that critical race theory is being taught to their children. And the reply from those on the school boards and also for many in the media is that critical race theory is just teaching history. Do you not want your kids to learn real history? There's this idea that these parents, many are white and many are black, but these parents want only a whitewashed version of history taught where America has only done good things. And their pushback against critical race theory is really the fact that they don't want slavery taught in schools. And the other pushback is, what are you talking about? Critical race theory? That's an obscure legal theory taught at graduate level law school. You think this is being taught to 5-year-olds in school? And it's this idea that they're just promoting conspiracy theories by even bringing this up at school board meetings. But the alternative, and what other people are saying, is that it is a Marxist conspiracy to infiltrate our schools and subvert the minds of our children and take over our country. So what is critical race theory? What is it? Is it just teaching history? Is it just an obscure legal theory taught in law schools to graduate students? Or is it a Marxist conspiracy to infiltrate our schools, subvert the minds of our children, and take over our country? Well, my goal is to clearly demonstrate that it is the latter. A lot of this is based on a lot of research that I've done, both in original sources, reading Critical Race Theory and Introduction, a lot of research and listening to people who are actual critical race theorists explain what critical race theory is from those very sources, and a fellow named James Lindsay, who has done overwhelming research on this topic. He's read like everything on critical race theory from the critical race theorists themselves, and so he knows what he's talking about. And he recently came out with a book called Race Marxism, and that's what he calls critical race theory. It's Marxism applied to race. Is that the case? Yes. Is that something we should worry about? Is Marxism bad in some way? Well, that's a whole other topic, but I don't understand why Marxism is somehow seen as acceptable when its beliefs have resulted in the deaths of over 100 million people when put into practice. We look at the word fascist as a bad word today, and it is. But why is Marxist somehow accepted in our culture and the word fascist is not? I have no idea. John Stonestreet, head of the Colson Center, he says that ideas and bad ideas have victims. And there has been nothing truer and more demonstrable in the 20th century than the idea of Marxism has had victims. And ideologies we have today, they don't come from nowhere. They have genealogies. They come from other sources. And James Lindsay in Race Marxism, he says we should not attempt to cure what we don't understand. And he makes the strong claim, very strong claim, but if it's true, we need to listen. He says, attempting to cure critical race theory is an obligation of every person in this world who wishes to remain free. Now, in my own history, I went to college originally to become a music teacher, but I was lazy in college and screwed around a lot in college and did not do the right thing. And instead of that, I ended up wanting to be an elementary school teacher. So I went through the education program there, took a couple of classes there, but was unable to finish because, again, my grade point average was too low because I was an underachiever. I partied and drank too much. I had the wrong priorities in college. So I looked at my manual of college and said, what can I actually graduate with based on what I took already? And I ended up with a political science degree with a concentration in political philosophy. I didn't know it at the time, but that concentration in political philosophy would give me a really good foundation for understanding movements and things that were happening today. And when I see things happening today, I see a lot of commonality between a lot of the things I hear people say in the Black Lives Matter movement, organization movement, on TV, a lot of these things, I see a lot of overlap between what I learned from certain political theorists in the past. And because ideas we have today have genealogies, they don't just come from nowhere. We need to understand what that genealogy is, especially if there's this claim that it's Marxism. I mean, that's a very strong claim. So we have to understand a little bit about what Marxism is. Now, what I am giving you is just a very broad overview. There is a lot more depth, there is a lot more nuance, there's a lot more evidence, but I am just going to walk you through the political philosophical background of critical race theory, where it comes from, and that progression, and the methods that they use to promote it, because it is incredibly insidious. And it's not just critical race theory, there's a lot of critical theories. Also, when you hear the word critical, a lot of times people think of critical thinking, applying a filter, a skepticism, and really digging into, drilling into, trying to figure out what is actually true. Critical, in the critical race theory and critical theories idea, has nothing to do with critical thinking. We'll get to exactly what it is, but it is not the same thing. It's a very different thing. So let's go back in history. We're going to start with a French philosopher. His name was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He lived from 1712 to 1778. He was almost like a counter-English Enlightenment philosopher. So there were philosophers like Hobbes and Locke. John Locke actually is the philosopher who said that man is entitled to certain rights. And the main three rights, he said, were life, liberty, and property. Now that may sound familiar. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence changed property to pursuit of happiness. And that change had some things to do with getting southern states who viewed slavery, and there was issues there in terms of property and slavery, but that's another topic. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on the other hand, he has a famous saying, he has a lot of famous saying, but he said that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. He taught, he was a utopianist. He believed that man was perfectible, that human nature was basically good. When you start with a wrong foundation and a wrong view on human nature, the idea that human nature is good, that we are perfectible, that we can create a utopia on earth, all kinds of evil have come from that idea. The French Revolution and the guillotine, killing thousands of people, chopping off their heads, absolutely brutal. The communist revolutions in Cuba, China, Cambodia, all these revolutions that have resulted in the deaths of tens of millions, over 100 million people dead at the feet of communism, which is Marxist, which is a utopian ideal. So he taught that man in the state of nature, a natural man, was a noble savage, that he was basically good, that he was like free. Like you have this depiction when you watch Pocahontas or you watch Avatar of these peaceful indigenous people or Native Americans who just lived at peace until the white men came over and introduced evil into the world. But no, human nature, the Bible says that human nature is evil. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We have an inclination towards doing the wrong thing, but we have the ability to do the right thing because God gave us free will. But if you start with the point that man is born free, everywhere he's in chains, well, he identifies in his philosophy what the basic problem is. If man is born free, if man in the state of nature is a noble savage, where does all the evil come from? Well, he identifies it as property. Once a man, a good man, stuck a stake in the ground and he said, this area is mine, that's when evil entered the world. So property and society has corrupted man. That's where evil comes from. So 40 years later, Karl Marx was born. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, and he came up with this idea and built on Rousseau's ideas. He also built on another philosopher called Hegel. I'm not going to get into the weeds with that. But Karl Marx came up with class conflict theory. That's his basic, that's what Marxism is. It is conflict theory. It is taking one group against another group, oppressors and oppressed, in Marxism, what the new critical theorists call vulgar Marxism, he saw the oppressors as the bourgeoisie, the people with money, the people that control the means of production. And the proletariat, the workers, were poor. They were exploited by the bourgeoisie. Their labor was taken advantage of and basically stolen from them so that they could be kept poor and the bourgeoisie could become rich. And so there's this conflict theory. Keep in mind what this is. Oppressed and oppressors. The oppressed were the proletariat. The oppressors were the bourgeoisie, the rich. So his is a class or an economic conflict theory. And his goal was the same as Rousseau's, was the abolition of property, especially bourgeois property, the property that the rich held. He saw a continuity, a progression of economic systems. It went from feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism. Capitalism would be replaced by socialism. And that is when there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat. There would be a big revolution. The workers of the world would unite. He says, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And that's in the Communist Manifesto. Now that's like Rousseau, who says man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. These chains, this slavery, this oppression comes from one group oppressing another group. And so he thought socialism, though, would have to be run by the government. Somebody would have to decide, and it would be a really difficult system, but it would be run by a dictatorship of the proletariat. That means the workers would be the dictators, and there would have to be a lot of bad things that would happen in this revolution. But the ultimate goal, once this system was in place of socialism, is that the state and the government would melt away. There would be no more need for it, and it would be replaced by a perfect world called communism, where there would be perfect equality. And the problem with a lot of this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he wrote The Social Contract. He wrote a discourse. He entered a contest, basically, and wrote the Discourse on Inequality. Where does inequality come from? And he would say that's society and property. Karl Marx looked at the same thing. Why is there inequality? This is a problem. Now, Thomas Sowell, in his book Discrimination and Disparities, explains inequality. Inequality comes, well, there could be oppression. We have to look at that. But inequality comes from the natural state of affairs when people are free. I am unequal to a doctor because I did not try to become a doctor. I had different desires. I wanted to do other things. I made different choices in life. If you look at two different cultures have different values. They have different norms. They have different standards. They have different sets of things that they consider important to them. And so they make different choices, and you have inequality in a free market, in a free world. You have inequality that's part of that. Well, I don't want to go too much into it. The problem with Marxism is Karl Marx expected revolution to happen in an industrialized country. But the problem is it never did. And the reason it never did in a country like Great Britain or Germany or the United States, that's where he expected this revolution to happen, is people did too well. The workers developed a good life for themselves. So you didn't just have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In the middle, you developed a middle class where people could work and they could make a good living for themselves because their labor had value to the people that hired them. Well, I'm not going to get into all the details of that because it's already going to be a long video. Sorry. But if you want to understand this, feel free to break it into parts. But it is very important to understand this. So this revolution happened in third world countries like Russia, Cuba, eventually China, and it was a complete disaster. But a lot of people had read the Communist Manifesto and Marx, and they were like, why is this not working? They saw in the economic sense, this is not going to work. There's too much, people are too happy, they're doing too well. They need a certain consciousness of their oppression and anger and angst that would cause them to want to have a revolution. If you're doing well, why would you want to have a revolution? Along came Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist, And eventually he was thrown in a prison because he was writing bad things about Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist dictator in Italy. He got thrown into prison and he wrote the prison notebooks. The biggest thing that came out of Antonio Gramsci was this idea of cultural hegemony. The word hegemony just means a dominant ideology or dominance. And he saw the need. There was a dominant culture that was, well, the bourgeoisie, but it was sort of, rather than an economic bourgeoisie, that was true too. There was the people that held the power, and they controlled the means of cultural production. Later on, there was, I think it was about 1968, a communist, a Marxist named Rudi Dutschke, who came up with a phrase that we need a long march through the institutions, that we need to change all these institutions, not just an economic revolution, but we had to make a very slow change, taking over every institution. Antonio Gramsci in the prison notebooks wrote that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools. Listen to this. Via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. So rather than taking over the proletariat, taking over the means of economic and industrial production, he realized that the Marxists would very slowly have to take over the means of cultural production, everything that produced culture in a society, including the church, including the universities, and that's where it started actually, and including the schools. So after Antonio Gramsci came, there was a group of Marxists in Frankfurt, Germany at Goethe University. I'm not very good at pronouncing German. It was called the Institute for Social Research, and they changed the name. It later became known as the Frankfurt School. And some of the important thinkers there, one of whom I'm going to say is just the most important, they came up with what we would call critical theory. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that is. Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, those were probably the biggest names. Jürgen Habermas, he has a little less to do with this, even though he's still very popular. But they came up with the idea of critical theory. The Frankfurt School got kicked out of Germany. Why? Because Hitler rose into power and he hated Marxists. And they moved from Germany to, guess where? New York City. Columbia University, elite Ivy League school. They relocated the Frankfurt School to there, and they started putting out their very harmful and destructive propaganda. Herbert Marcuse is the one I'm going to focus on because I think he's the most relevant to critical theory and a lot of what we see today. Angela Davis actually was one of his students. She was a radical lesbian Marxist, sometimes seen as a hero. And I don't know, I mean, Marxism, for some reason, it has a different sort of view from people than fascism. It's like they're revolutionaries, they're freedom fighters, but it's the most harmful ideology of the 20th century, even the 21st century, and is responsible for so many deaths, so much destruction, so much misery. I mean, if you have equality as a goal, you have to be careful because words sound really good. It sounds good that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're created equal, but why should we expect them to be equal in terms of the outcome? Because when people are different, we shouldn't expect equal results. And if you force equality, and they have a new word for that, equality of outcome is called equity. When you hear that word equity, which used to mean just fairness or justice, it means equality of outcome. That's how it's judged. Equality of outcome is something that has to be forced. There is no natural path to equality of outcome just because people are different. And so when you saw with communism, is equality of outcome made everyone poor, made everything worse for everyone. Yes, in America we have inequality, and there's things we can work on to help the poor and the people that have less. But in a free country, you're going to have people that do better and people that do worse, and people that study hard in school and people that screw around and don't work hard in school. That's choices I made, and I had consequences from those choices. By the way, I did go to Graduate school, after I got married, after my first son Luke was born, and right before my second son Andrew was born, paid my own money for that school. Of course, I had a loan from the previous school, and I got a 3.97 GPA, and I finally got my master's in elementary education. So I learned a lot more about that. But that education degree, well, there was a lot less of what I'll get to when I get to critical pedagogy or critical teaching. But Herbert Marcuse came up with a couple ideas that I really want to highlight. There's a lot in Herbert Marcuse and the other Frankfurt School critical theorists, but they were all Marxists. All of them were Marxists, but they wanted to change, rather than Marxism being an economic theory, they wanted it to be a cultural theory. And Herbert Marcuse came up with this idea, well, they all did, of this idea of false consciousness. In other words, for there to be a Marxist revolution, people have to be dissatisfied, not just like things aren't going that great, but so dissatisfied, so enraged that they would actually want to overthrow everything and have a revolution. The problem is people were happy. People were realizing things are going okay. And so he called it, they have a false consciousness. They don't realize they're oppressed because the oppressors are over them, fooling them. And so he wanted to remove this false consciousness. They had to create such great anger, such great hatred, such great feelings of oppression in people that they would actually want a revolution. Now listen to this, because hopefully maybe you're already starting to see inklings from this of what we've seen recently in terms of race riots and Black Lives Matter and some of that stuff. And I'll say something about Black Lives Matter in a minute, but Herbert Marcuse wrote three really important essays. One is Repressive Tolerance. We're going to look at some quotes from that because they're very appropriate. One-Dimensional Man, and an essay on liberation. He wrote One-Dimensional Man, he wrote in 1964. Repressive Tolerance, I think, was 1965, and an essay on liberation was 1968. We're going to focus mostly on repressive tolerance, but they all talk about false consciousness and things like that in detail, and they overlap. But repressive tolerance is the main one. So he writes in the introduction of Repressive Tolerance, I read the whole essay, but he says, this essay examines the idea of tolerance in our advanced industrial society. The conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerance to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. So I'll just give you an overview. He sees we cannot show tolerance toward everything. We can't tolerate the things that are already existing, those things that are in power, because they are oppressive systems. When you tolerate oppressive systems, you're tolerating oppression. So you should be intolerant of all of the things that already exist and the power structures that already exist, and express tolerance toward the revolutionaries, toward the minority, toward the oppressed. This is really, really important because we see a lot of this today. So he says, in other words, today tolerance appears again as what it was in its origins, at the beginning of the modern period, a partisan goal, a subversive, liberating notion and practice. In other words, tolerance has to be used in a very specific way, in a subversive way. We should only tolerate, though we should be completely intolerant, extend zero tolerance towards ideas that are hostile towards the revolution, and be extraordinarily tolerant of the things, of the revolutionary kind of things. And he'll explain more clearly what this means. Conversely, what is proclaimed and practiced as tolerance today is in many ways one of its most effective manifestations serving the cause of oppression. So tolerance today is serving the cause of oppression, so we need to get rid of that. He says tolerance is extended to policies, conditions, and modes of behavior which should not be tolerated because they are impeding, if not destroying, the chances of creating an existence without fear and misery. Tolerating the power structures that already exist is you're on the wrong side of history. You can't be tolerant of things that are destroying the chances of creating an existence without fear and misery. So again, he is a utopian. It's like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like Karl Marx. He saw this utopia. There's this perfect world without fear and misery. But the things that are blocking it are the false consciousness, the sense that everything is okay, and the lack of revolutionary zeal that we have because we're doing too well. We don't realize how oppressed we are. So we can't tolerate the existing systems. We have to be intolerant of them. We have to fight them. He says the tolerance expressed in such impartiality, he's saying this impartiality is wrong, serves to minimize or even absolve prevailing intolerance and suppression. If objectivity has anything to do with truth, and if truth is more than a matter of logic and science, then this kind of objectivity is false and this kind of tolerance inhuman. He actually goes back to Rousseau, because Rousseau believed that truth isn't just a set of facts that we look at. He was against Enlightenment rationalism. So is critical theory. They're very against logic, reason, those things, because they are systems that the oppressors use to keep other people down. And Rousseau had very high value on sincerity and emotion and feelings being a way to ascertain truth. And so this is kind of what he's talking about. Objectivity, logic, and science, this kind of tolerance is inhuman. He says, and if it is necessary to break the established universe of meaning and the practice enclosed in this universe in order to enable man to find out what is true and false, this deceptive impartiality towards tolerance of things that already exist would have to be abandoned. Listen to this. The people exposed to this impartiality are no tabula rasa. They are indoctrinated by the conditions under which they live and think, and which they do not transcend. Tabula rasa, the idea comes from John Locke. He says that man is a tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. We are born as a blank slate, and everything that we are is imprinted by nurture, by the environment. In other words, you've heard the argument nature versus nurture. John Locke was very much on the nurture side of things. And he is as well, Marcuse's saying, there is no impartiality. Man is not a blank slate. They are indoctrinated by the conditions under which they live and think, in which they do not transcend. In other words, you cannot transcend the way that you think, because you are programmed to think this way by our evil culture, oppressive culture. He says, surely no government can be expected to foster its own subversion, but in a democracy, such a right is vested in the people. That is, in the majority of the people. So he's saying our government, the US government, is not going to foster its own subversion, its own overthrow, its own revolution. That the people have to do that. This means that the ways should not be blocked on which a subversive majority could develop. That's what he wanted, a subversive majority to develop, a revolutionary majority. And if they are blocked by organized repression and indoctrination, their reopening may require apparently undemocratic means. He's saying we can't overthrow the systems in power through democratic means. What is he talking about? He's talking about whatever it takes. Violence, subversion, taking over institutions, whatever it takes. Non-democratic means, not through voting, not through convincing people, not through reason. He says, moreover, the restoration of freedom of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teaching and practices in the educational institutions, which by their very methods and concepts serve to enclose the mind within the established universe of discourse and behavior, thereby precluding a priori, that's before the fact, a rational evaluation of the alternatives. In other words, in our educational institutions, they are promulgating the same systems that are oppressing people. And so real restoration of real freedom of thought means we have to be intolerant. We need rigid restrictions on teaching the things that are oppressive. We can't have just freedom. We can't have an open dialogue between just different competing ideas, because those are all only promoting these systems of oppression that are already in place. If you've seen anything about cancel culture, hopefully you have nowadays, you'll see why certain ideas in universities have become the most intolerant places. We'll say more about that in a minute. He says liberating tolerance, this is the good tolerance, then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as of discussion and propaganda, of deed as well as of word. All right, I'm going to skip the last sentence. We're going to move on in a minute, but think about this. Intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. In other words, anything from the left, no matter how violent, no matter what it is, we should be tolerant of those things, because then we normalize that. And intolerance against movements from the right. Now, you may disagree with me, but I'm going to just give an example. From 2020, after the George Floyd murder by Derek Chauvin, and that's what it was. It was a horrific murder, horrible to watch. There were all these riots. There were burning down of police stations, attacking of courthouses, federal property, policemen killed, deaths of black people skyrocketed. A lot of our communities became much more unsafe, especially in the blackest communities. There were just a lot more deaths, a lot more killings. It was really horrific. And yes, there were peaceful protests, but a lot of the media didn't highlight. They made it sound like this is what this is, with a few aberrational things. But the aberrational things, the riots, there was a lot of it. There was $2 billion worth of property damage during all of that. Never mind the loss to life, children being killed. It was horrible. But tolerance was extended to that because it was a movement from the left. On the other hand, on January 6th, you had a bunch of people, mostly white, marching on the Capitol, going into the Capitol. 3 people died in that, 2 of natural causes. I mean, one had a heart attack. I think one had a stroke. The third one was killed by a police officer. None of these right-wingers killed any police. Some of them did some things that were really bad, but they were all lumped into and told that this was an armed insurrection. If it was armed, where were their guns? They did a really poor job of it. But and I wasn't for this. I'm against it. I think it was horrible. The January 6th, I'm not calling it an insurrection because I think the insurrection carries with it the idea that it's an attempt to take over the government. They were not. Maybe a few were doing that, but you can't lump all of them in that same thing. And so I'm not excusing that, nor am I excusing the riots that caused far more destruction. But you could see that they're having congressional hearings. They made a really big deal out of the January 6th quote unquote insurrection. But this happens in many, many cases where you'll have on college campuses people saying the craziest things on the left, and they cannot be criticized. And somebody even saying, wait a minute, and asking just simple questions, pushing back on things. There is zero tolerance for that. They're called a something phobe, a transphobe, a homophobe, a racist. Well, racist means a lot more than it used to mean. Okay, better move on. This, I'm just going to read. I didn't highlight any of this because it's just, the whole page is huge. The whole post-fascist period is one of clear and present danger. In other words, the time since Hitler after 1946, 1947, he's raising, fascism is a clear and present danger. I would say Marxism is a much worse one. Consequently, true pacification requires the withdrawal of tolerance before the deed at the stage of communication in word, print, and picture. In other words, we need to withdraw our tolerance of anything that could support fascism, which is anything that's against everything is called fascist that is against the communist revolution and Marxism. Such extreme suspension of the right of free speech and free assembly is indeed justified Extreme suspension of the right of free speech and free assembly, our First Amendment, suspension of our First Amendment, is indeed justified only if the whole of society is in extreme danger. Well, guess what? I maintain that our society is in such an emergency situation and that it has become the normal state of affairs. Different opinions and philosophies can no longer compete peacefully for adherence and persuasion on rational grounds. The marketplace of ideas is organized and delimited by those who determine the national and the individual interest. In this society, for which the ideologists have proclaimed the end of ideology, the false consciousness, there's that words, has become the general consciousness, from the government down to its last objects. Cultural hegemony, false consciousness has permeated every aspect of American culture, and that is why it has to be fought against tooth and nail, according to Marcuse. The small and powerless minorities which struggle against the fake consciousness, false consciousness, and its beneficiaries must be helped. Their continued existence is more important than the preservation of abused rights and liberties which grant constitutional powers to those who oppress these minorities. It should be evident by now that the exercise of civil rights by those who don't have them presupposes the withdrawal of civil rights from those who prevent their exercise, and that liberation of the damned of the earth presupposes suppression not only of their old but also of their new masters. So he's saying that we are not going to have a revolution in the standard sense. The workers are not going to revolt because the workers, the white people, are the new bourgeoisie. They have property, they have these things. And so we have to look for new people, new groups, new identities that are going to foster this revolution. And in other essays, he talks about where he's looking for those. He sees a lot of commonality and revolutionary zeal in the black and the minority community. The Black Panthers, Black liberation movements, Black liberation theology. He sees commonality there as well as sexual minorities, and that's why you'll see commonality and people coming together in the trans rights, the LGBTQ plus IA, all that stuff with Black Lives Matter. Look at the new flag. It has the LGBTQ, the T, the trans colors, light blue and light pink, and it has the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and some flags even include intersex and some other things. It's trying to gather as many supposedly oppressed and marginalized groups as possible to create this revolution, and it's been very successful. He says, but I believe that there is a natural right of resistance, which is funny because critical theorists actually criticize the idea of rights. They're distrustful of rights. Anyway, there is a natural right, maybe that's why he put it in quotes, of resistance for oppressed and overpowered minorities to use extra legal means if the legal ones have proved to be inadequate. Riots, killings, going around the law. Law and order, we heard this during the riots. Donald Trump wanted to restore law and order. Law and order are always and everywhere the law and order which protect the established hierarchy. It is nonsensical to invoke the absolute authority of this law and this order against those who suffer from it and struggle against it, not for personal advantages and revenge, but for their share of humanity. These people, they just want to have their share of humanity. When we invoke law and order, we're invoking the system that's oppressing them. There is no other judge over them than the constituted authorities, the police, and their own conscience. If they use violence, they do not start a new chain of violence. In other words, all of these riots and this violence is not a new chain of violence, but it's trying to break an established one, the violence that is perpetrated against them by the police, by those in authority over them, those that oppress them, those that keep them from being able to speak out and march, except they have the freedom to do that in this country. If they use, they didn't always, but this is 2022, let's be real. And think of this, the idea of false consciousness is something that has to be promoted even more vigorously now than ever, and people being told and indoctrinated into how oppressed they actually are, because things have just gotten so much better in this country for every group. I mean, a gay person can do anything they want in this country. A trans person, there's nobody keeping them from getting jobs, from going to college, from making a life for themselves. So they have to really be indoctrinated into how horrible and oppressed they really are. Since they will be punished for their violence, they know the risk, and when they are willing to take it, no third person, at least of all the educator and intellectual, has the right to preach them abstention. In other words, educators and intellectuals should be on the side of the oppressed, even if they're committing violent acts. That's what repressive tolerance is. It's the righteous, the liberating tolerance needs to be shown to these people. The extension of social legislation to the poor, he says, as against the virulent denunciation that such a policy would do away with the sacred liberalistic principle of equality for the other side. The idea of we want to hear both sides is actually repressive because one side already has dominance. So that side, the dominant side, the hegemonic voices have to be silenced, and voices of the oppressed have to be elevated. He says, I maintain that there are issues where either there is no other side in any more than a formalistic sense, or where the other side is demonstrably regressive and impedes possible improvement of the human condition. To tolerate propaganda for inhumanity vitiates the goals not only of liberalism, but of every progressive political philosophy. Liberalism, he uses that. They're against liberalism, true freedom, enlightenment, rationalism, all of these things. So liberalism for them is a bad thing because it promotes the established order. Part of this struggle is the fight against an ideology of tolerance which in reality favors and fortifies the conservation of the status quo of inequality and discrimination. For this struggle, I propose the practice of discriminating tolerance. To be sure, this practice already presupposes the radical goal which it seeks to achieve. I committed this petitio principii, which is basically circular reasoning. It's assuming, making an assumption of what he's trying to prove to start with, in order to combat the pernicious ideology that tolerance is already institutionalized in this society. The tolerance which is the life element, the token of a free society, will never be the gift of the powers that be. It can, under the prevailing conditions of tyranny by the majority, only be won in the sustained effort of radical minorities willing to break this tyranny and to work for the emergence of a free and sovereign majority. Minorities intolerant, militantly intolerant, and disobedient to the rules of behavior which tolerate destruction and suppression. This just seems so clearly what we have been seeing for the last several years, and it has been growing. Herbert Marcuse's philosophies have been spreading and have had tremendous influence. And so that's the Frankfurt School. That's their philosophies. That's Herbert Marcuse. They are the founders of critical theory. They are Marxists, but they apply Marxism instead of something just economic. Now they call that old Marxism vulgar Marxism because it's not going to work because people are doing too well economically. It's a new Marxism. It's a cultural Marxism. It's neo-Marxism. And it's basically the idea that we are applying Marxism to all other categories. And so critical theory, I'll give you the definition from Max Horkheimer, one of the key founders of the Frankfurt School in critical theory. It criticizes, that's why it's critical, it criticizes and challenges power structures. Its goal is, and this is what Max Horkheimer says, is critiquing and changing society as a whole. No critical theory is just like a theory that people talk about and discuss, that it's just like we think of theories ourselves as something like it's something theoretical, it's in the mind. No. Critical theory is activist. It seeks to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. That's Karl Marx. They are enslaved by an oppressive system, by the cultural hegemonic system that oppresses them, that keeps them down. Everything that exists is in existence to oppress those minorities, and so they have to use extra legal means to overcome it. So critical theories are activist in nature. They are not just some obscure theory taught in law school that's just theoretical in nature, like theoretical physics. It's activist in nature. Its goal is to change. Also, critical theories are only negative. In other words, I watched a debate between a Marxist, a socialist, and a capitalist, both economists. And all the Marxists did in the debate was attacked capitalism and attacked inequality. But he gave no positive vision for Marxism. And when brought up and called out on the fact that Marxism and communism has killed over 100 million people, both starving to death and thrown into gulags and tortured and murdered anybody who stood against those ideologies. And his response is, well, we've learned from those things, we can do it better now. But he had no positive vision for any of it. Critical theory is a utopian theory. It envisions a perfect world. If only we could overthrow, if only we could have this revolution, it will lead to utopia. But there is never a definition of what this utopia looks like or how we get there. All it is an attack on what already exists. It is incredibly destructive. Under the umbrella of critical theory came many other subsets of critical theory. All of these are critical theories, but they're applied to different areas. A really big one is critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is teaching, education. It has infiltrated all of our educational institutions. And so these are all of our colleges, all of our educational institutions that are teaching our teachers how to teach. And every teacher in public schools in America have to get a teaching degree from these institutions. They have to go through this indoctrination and brainwashing basically into critical Marxist pedagogy. One of the most widely read and heralded books in teaching. Almost all education students have to read it. I was just talking, I didn't have to when I got my teaching degree in 2006, but somebody who got it more recently, 2016, had to read this book. Almost every education student in the country has to read this, and it has nothing to do with education, with how to teach, with how to maintain classroom management. It's brainwashing. It's from a Brazilian educator. His name was Paulo Freire, and he wrote this book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And basically, the whole book promotes revolution, and it extols the virtues of Mao Zedong, who did the Cultural Revolution in China, responsible for the deaths of about 40 million Chinese people. Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution. He extols the virtues of these things in his book, Critical Pedagogy. Its goal is to point out how oppressed people are. It's no wonder we're seeing all of these things come out in schools when teachers have to go through this indoctrination. Teachers, when they come up with their lesson plans, in their lesson plans, it's not only what they're teaching, how to differentiate instruction, how to make sure that kids that are advanced are getting good instruction and being pushed, and kids that are struggling are being helped. It is applying a filter in every lesson plan of how am I incorporating social justice into this lesson plan. No wonder our educational institutions are failing. No wonder kids are being taught this garbage in schools and being indoctrinated, not just in college, and that's what's happening in colleges and universities. Almost all of them. Your kids are going to college to get this kind of an education. It's infiltrating math, even math, physics, and engineering departments. It's insane. But he came up with the idea of, and I bought into a lot of this, of child-centered education versus teacher-directed. In other words, that education should be a partnership between teacher and children rather than teachers just teaching and filling their kids' heads with facts. Now, teacher-directed instruction should not be just teachers talking and students just getting facts put into their brain. They should be taught to think critically. Lessons should be engaging. Lessons should involve the students. But he misrepresents what teacher-directed instruction is. It's called a straw man argument in order to attack it. He says there is no such thing as a neutral education. The irony of, when we think of the students that are taught this in college are being taught as if it's true. In other words, they're not coming with their college professors together and deciding the truth themselves and figuring it out. They are being taught using teacher-centered instruction. That teacher-centered instruction is wrong. It's very ironic. And there's also the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. What? The Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education? I thought critical race theory wasn't in our schools. I thought it was just an obscure legal theory. Sorry, I got to get through this faster. Other subsets of critical theory are critical gender studies, intersectional feminism, queer theory. But one of the important ones, because we're talking specifically about critical race theory today, well, gender studies and queer theory have led us to this whole trans ideology that has come out. I'm just going to point that out. This is not a separate thing from critical race theory. They're very closely interconnected, where kids at a very young age are being indoctrinated into trans and queer ideologies. That's purposeful. So, but one of the critical theories was critical legal studies, which was applying, criticizing, and challenging power structures in the legal field, looking how laws impacted and kept down the oppressed. Out of critical legal studies, they had this big meeting, and they invited several key black people, and the black people said, why are you ignoring black voices in this discussion? Out of that came critical race theory. Critical race theory, the one who is seen as the founder of it is Derek Bell. He wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. I'm going to mention that in a minute. And also Kimberly Crenshaw, she was Derek Bell's student at Harvard Law. And so it did start in law school, but because critical theories are activist in nature, its goal is not to stay in school. Its goal is to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them, critiquing and changing society. So it's not just a theory in the way that we see theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell's student, is actually the one who came up with the name critical race theory. There's a subset of critical race theory called critical whiteness studies. Robin DiAngelo, Peggy McIntosh, they would be critical whiteness studies people. But that's a subset of critical race theory. People, when they bring authors like Robin DiAngelo up, who wrote White Fragility, I'm going to do a review of that book maybe next. We'll see how long this goes. That'll be quicker. When Robin DiAngelo is brought up, people will say, oh, that's not critical race theory. But that's one of the tactics they use. But critical whiteness studies is part of critical race theory. So here are the core tenets of critical race theory. I pulled these tenets right out of Critical Race Theory, An Introduction by critical race theorists Gene Stefanchik and Richard Delgado. And also I pull James Lindsay's book, Race Marxism. But these are, not every critical race theorist is going to say, yes, I buy into all these things. But this is basically the core tenets and beliefs of critical race theory. And so you'll see where these come out. First, we start with something that Christians should agree with, that race is a social construct. Race is not a real thing. All human beings are one race, the human race. Critical race theory would agree with that, but they would say it is socially significant. It's something white people created, the idea of race, so that they could oppress a certain group of other people, specifically black, indigenous, and people of color. So race is a social construct, but it is socially significant. That is why they use it as a primary factor, primary way of viewing the world. Number two, racism is normal and permanent. It is not aberrational. Derek Bell, in his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the subtitle is The Permanence of Racism. Racism has existed. It is normal. It is never going to be gone. It is really depressing. Racism is not individual. It's not just, we think of racism as an individual racist, Bubba with the 2 teeth down in Mississippi. No offense if you're from Mississippi. But this is the idea of the racist, the guy with the white hood, the person in the Klan. They've changed the meaning of racism from something that is an individual act where you think less of people of other races and maybe treat them as less, which is discrimination, but it's embedded in institutions. So maybe you've heard the idea of systemic or institutional racism. It comes from that. Number 4 is the idea of storytelling, narrative weaving, counter storytelling. If you look at the incidents of Michael Brown, we're not looking at the facts of the Michael Brown case. He was killed by a cop. The narrative that initially came out, and you may have heard this, is hands up, don't shoot. And that came from the idea that Michael Brown was on his knees with his hands up, and the racist cop executed him, just walked up to him, put his gun to his head, and shot him. However, this was investigated by Barack Obama's administration, by Eric Holder, his black attorney general. The Justice Department looked into this and exonerated the cop. The witnesses that were there said the hands up, don't shoot narrative is a false narrative. This did not happen. And yet we still see this. Michael Brown attacked the cop. So the cop shot him in self-defense. Those are the facts of the case. But the story, the narrative weaving, is that hands up, don't shoot. So we still hear this. Lived experience, number 5, there's this idea of the unique voice of color, that we get to truth not by the facts, not by statistics, but by the lived experience of the marginalized. Truth and validity of your voice depends on your standpoint, where you're coming from. That, in other words, you have access to truth in a way as an oppressed person that an oppressor could not gain access to. A white person cannot understand discrimination by toward black people because we are not a black person. You get unique insights unavailable to oppressor groups. Number 6 is a huge one, especially from Derek Bell, is interest convergence. Interest convergence is that whites only have a desire to keep their system of oppression going, and they only support civil rights when they somehow benefit. Derek Bell uses the example of Brown versus Board Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson said that you can have segregation, legal segregation, and the idea of that blacks and whites could be separate but equal. Well, that never materialized, that equality. And so Brown versus Board of Education overturned that. And the only reason whites supported that and supported civil rights because they were against communism, and they didn't want communism to make inroads. And so they only supported it because they benefited from it. It's very negative and cynical in terms of human nature. Number 7 is intersectionality. And that's basically the idea of you are your group identity. Kimberly Crenshaw, the one who came up with the name critical race theory for critical race theory, it's a critical theory applied to race. She came up with intersectionality, that you are, your oppression or oppressed status depends on your group identities. In other words, as a black person, you have access to knowledge and oppression that a black person would have as a black male. But a black female would have 2 axes of oppression, both being female and being black. So they have access to truth and knowledge about oppression that a black male would not have. If you are a black lesbian female, you have even greater oppression status. And so your voice has even more weight in terms of determining truth and having the power and ability to speak. Cultural hegemony, I talked about that with Antonio Gramsci, the idea that we have to take over the culture based on group identity. In critical race theory, the ultimate oppressor is white, straight, cis heteronormative. Cis just means you are the gender that you were born assigned at birth. I won't get into that too much, but basically me, I am the ultimate oppressor. It doesn't look at individuals. It doesn't say, okay, well, this white person was born in Appalachia to drug-addicted parents on meth, and they have nothing, no opportunity in rural West Virginia. Well, it doesn't look at that at all as any kind of oppression, because it doesn't fit into the narrative that critical race theory is weaving. And versus, a black person who's an attorney, or a black person who has both parents in the home. It doesn't look at things that way. It doesn't look at individuals. It only looks at group identities, which is unbiblical. Anti-racism as practice, that's number 9. That comes from Ibram X. Kendi, who will say, oh, I'm not a critical race theorist, but everything he says comes from critical race theory. He basically says that you can't just be neutral or not racist, you have to be anti-racist. If you're not anti-racist, you are pro-racist. And he explains what that means. Number 10 is whiteness as property. In other words, Property was the enemy in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Marx's philosophy. Property is the enemy. We have to get rid of bourgeois property. What replaced the idea of property as the great evil or sin is the idea of whiteness. And that's why you hear everything called whiteness or white supremacy, or that's a factor of whiteness, is that whiteness has become the original sin. That's replaced property in the Marxist ideology, in critical race theory. And finally is historical revisionism, and that is their willingness, and Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, specifically in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, admit this, that they revise history, that they look at history, how it's taught, and they change it to come from the voices of the oppressed. A couple examples of this is a very famous book, and a lot of people have to read this in college too. It's trash. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. In fact, in Good Will Hunting, Will, the really smart kid, says, you should read A People's History of the United States. It'll, I forget what he says, knock your socks off. I think he throws a curse word in there. But that's basically a retelling of the history of the United States only through the lens of the oppressed. It is a very one-sided view of history. And you may have heard of the 1619 Project by the New York Times. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author and editor and the one who put it all together. She basically put forward the idea that the American Revolution, the purpose of the American Revolution, was not to fight against Great Britain, but it was to preserve slavery. It's a completely false narrative, but it's seen through the lens of critical race theory. If everything is about race, if that's the primary lens through which we view everything, then that we look at everything with that cynical lens. The American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. That has been debunked. The New York Times had to retract that. They didn't do it as vigorously as they should have, but the whole 1619 Project is a look at history through the lens of the oppressed. In other words, seeing the white people as bad. And you have this idea, just looking at historical revisionism. Yes, we should learn history. We should learn the good, the bad, and the ugly of American history. History is nuanced. People in different cultural situations had to make different choices, and some of them were difficult, and some of them had to involve trade-offs, like the Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution, like slavery wasn't overturned right in the beginning of America's founding because we wouldn't have had an America because the southern states never would have joined. In the original Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wanted to go against King George for giving us the institution of slavery. America didn't create slavery. It was already in existence, and it's existed in every culture. American slavery was not a new kind of slavery. We're told that it was. American white Europeans did not go into northern Africa and raid villages and just steal and kidnap black people. They were sold. Slaves were sold to the Europeans on the coast because there were diseases in Africa that killed the Europeans. They were afraid to go in. They were sold by their fellow black people to the white Europeans. There was complicity on both sides and in both groups. Maybe if slavery didn't exist, things would have been different, and slavery was a horrible institution. But there's only one. Slavery was also, there were millions of white Europeans, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, areas like that, the coast of Marseille, the coast of southern France, where the Barbary pirates, which were the Moors, the black North Africans, were raiding villages in Europe and enslaving people there in absolutely horrible conditions. So slavery has always existed, but the first culture to get rid of slavery was Great Britain and America. It was Western culture that finally decided, especially Christian Western culture, that slavery was a moral evil that could no longer be tolerated. And that's why it fought. But there is no nuance in this historical revisionism. There is only one way of thinking of things, that blacks were peaceful. And maybe they were to some degree. They were just peaceful tribes living off the land in Africa, and these evil white people came in and kidnapped them. That is not true history either. So in the book Race Marxism, I'm going to give you a true definition of critical race theory, boil it down. to three options. The third option is actually, I think, the most powerful. One is calling everything you want to control racist or white supremacy until it is fully under your control. Number two is a Marxian conflict theory of race. In other words, it's race Marxism. It's Marx's conflict theory that was economic or class conflict, and it's replaced by race conflict. And number three is a belief that racism created by white people for their own benefit is the fundamental organizing principle of society. That's what critical race theory is. When you see this idea woven into schools, elementary schools, school districts, and people denying it, the idea is racism is created by white people for their own benefit, that racism is the fundamental organizing principle of society. It is the worldview, it is the lens through which we have to see everything, every interaction. So, for example, in the introduction to the textbook, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction, by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, critical race theory is characterized explicitly in these terms. He says, the critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but it places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group and self-interest, and emotions and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, so we look at Martin Luther King, we look at the civil rights movement. Unlike this discourse, which stresses incrementalism, that means slow, gradual change and improvement, and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So, the idea of equality is something that critical race theory, or equality of opportunity, is something that critical race theory rejects. He says, although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. It is no longer, and this is in the early 2000s, I think 2001 this book was written, so 21 years ago. It is no longer an obscure legal theory taught in law school. It is an activist theory. Its goal is social change. It began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education, what? It's not in schools, it's not in education. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, controversies over curriculum, and history in IQ and achievement testing. In other words, they are skeptical of these things. They want to overthrow these things in education, and that's what they're doing. They are applying critical race theory. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory. So if you have African American studies courses coming to your school, you can expect that this is the lens by which they will use it. In every school in Connecticut, they are forced by executive order of Ned Lamont, our governor, to include an elective on, I will call it critical race theory, on African American studies and on Hispanic and Puerto Rican studies as well. Having looked at this curriculum myself, it comes from that perspective. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Wait, Robin DiAngelo's critical whiteness studies, I thought that wasn't part of CRT. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. I hope you understand this. This comes from critical race theory and introduction. Also in their book, they talk about how critical race theory came about. They were a group, about 30 people. They met together, I think it was in a convent in Wisconsin. And he says, it was kind of funny because they were a group of Marxists. He used that term, a group of Marxists, or a collection of Marxists meeting in a convent. Critical race theory is race Marxism. It is Marxism applied to race. What are their goals? They have two main goals. Number one is to indoctrinate and create more critical race theorists. It spreads like a virus. It infects its hosts. That's how it got into all of our educational institutions. From our educational institutions, it infected the minds of university students a lot, mostly in the education schools, but also in a lot of other departments. And because of repressive tolerance, people who had questions or wanted to put on the brakes or speak against it were not allowed to speak. They were canceled. And its ultimate goal is a revolution that overthrows all norms, traditions, and power structures in our society. Its goal is revolution, to tear down everything and to rebuild their perfect utopia. You can't have that without a revolution. Finally, let's look at their methods, because these are the tactics that they use to promote critical race theory. One is lying and obfuscating. Now, I have to be careful about the motives. Not everybody who promotes critical race theory, they understand exactly what it is. A lot of them are just repeating what they hear on the media. So they hear on the media, oh, it's just an obscure legal theory, and they just want to teach real history, and they'll repeat those. But they don't really understand the background of critical race theory. I could go into a lot more detail on a lot of this stuff. But like I said, read Race Marxism if you want to get more information. Or listen to James Lindsay's new discourses, or you can follow Christopher Rufo, who is mounting a lot of the challenges that you see in school board meetings. But those people that are the main promoters of critical race theory, they lie and they obfuscate. They lie. They're like the devil. When they move their lips, they're lying. Anytime, for any example brought up, the response is, that's not critical race theory. So when you're arguing and you say this is critical race theory, I'll show you a video of Joy Reid talking to Christopher Rufo, and he's explaining what critical race theory is. You could see her methods, Joy Reid's methods of fighting back. Joy Reid is either ignorant about what critical race theory really is, or she is lying. She is not a good person. So she'll say, that's not critical race theory, or they're not a critical race theorist.
We reached out to him. We asked him if he's a critical race theorist. He said, I admire critical race theory, but I don't identify as a critical race theorist. I'm not a legal scholar, so I wasn't trained on critical race theory. I'm a historian. And Chris would know this if he actually read my work or understood that critical race theory is taught in law schools. I didn't attend law school, which is where critical race theory is taught. It's really the only place it's taught. NBC has looked into everywhere, and it's not taught in elementary school. But hold on.
First of all, it's very interesting to me that so many people are now running away from the race of the label of critical race theory. But
he's not a critical race theorist.
Hold on. I'm going to quote two critical race theorists. Barbara Applebaum, with the book Being Good, Being White. She says, quote, all white people are racist. Robin DiAngelo, who's another critical whiteness studies scholar, says that, quote,
it's basically gaslighting. Well, you could look more up on the term gaslighting, but it's like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? Making you sound like you're crazy, like you don't know what you're talking about. Another one is a Kafka trap. They'll say, of course you're a racist. A real racist would deny it. If you deny that you're a racist, it shows that you're a racist. In the book White Fragility, she said asking for evidence of racism is racist. The Mott and Bailey is one of the most common. The Mott and Bailey, there's a castle structure here. I'll show you a picture. It's basically a structure in medieval history where you have the Mott, which is up on a big hill. It's a very well protected and fortified structure. And down that hill is the Bailey. That's where people live. That's where the shops are. And when an invading force would come, they would retreat from the Bailey and go to the Mott. So the Bailey, in the case of critical race theory, is the 1619 Project, teaching critical race theory, or promoting, activating, being activists, practicing critical race theory in schools with children. When they promote these things, they're trying to spread it. They're trying to create little revolutionaries. They're brainwashing and indoctrinating children. But when called on it, they retreat to the Mott. What are you talking about? We're just trying to teach honest history. Are you against teaching slavery? Are you against teaching history? And then there's the reverse Mott and Bailey. The reverse Mott and Bailey is an abuse of language. They take terms that we all agree with that are emotionally charged. Racism. Are you against racism? Of course you're against racism, but then they redefine what they mean by the word racism and try to put you in that new box. So they abuse language by using charged words with new loaded meanings, such as anti-racist. You should be against racism. Are you against racism? Then you must be an anti-racist. Then you should believe all these things. Do you believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion? Of course. Who doesn't believe in diversity? Equity, yeah, that's equality. That sounds good. Or inclusion. But diversity, equity, and inclusion are very nice sounding words that are used to inject critical race theory into all of these institutions and to silence and practice repressive tolerance against anyone that fights it. They do not want free speech. They want these people shut down. The idea of equity is not equality or fairness. It is equality of outcome, that everyone should have the same results. And the only way to get that is to chop off people's heads at the top, like the guillotine, to take money from people that earned it and give it to other people. To practice affirmative action, which is an absolute disaster for black people. I'll explain why another time. The idea of diversity, how could anyone be against diversity? But when they mean diversity, they don't mean people that think differently. They just mean people that look differently, but all have to believe the same thing. They do not want, they said we need to listen to people of color. Well, okay, I listen to Thomas Sowell, I listen to Jason Riley, I listen to John McWhorter, I listen to Larry Elder. They're like, no, not those voices. The only black voices they want to hear are the black people that agree with what they already said. The idea of social justice. How could you be against social justice? How could you be against racial justice? How could you be against reproductive justice? Isn't justice good? But when they put an adjective before the word justice, usually they are subverting the meaning of justice and changing it to something else. Black Lives Matter. Using that phrase, how could anyone disagree with that? Of course Black Lives Matter. If you're a human being, if you're a Christian, you better uphold that Black Lives Matter, because black people, all people, were made in the image of God. They have inestimable value and worth. Their skin color has no bearing on that value whatsoever. But then Black Lives Matter promotes policies that are very anti-black lives. Their goal is really to promote Marxism. That's what they're doing. That's why the founders of it said we are trained Marxists. Their goal is revolution, to overthrow society. The only black lives that matter to them are the black lives that are useful for their cause. The very few that are killed, unarmed people that are killed by the police, they elevate, and they don't care about people in the black community that are being destroyed, the single fatherlessness. They don't care about those things. They don't fight for those issues. In fact, they promote them on their own page. When it gave their core values, it said the dismantling of the Western notion of the nuclear family. Another fallacy they use is the straw man fallacy. That's when you misrepresent your opponent's argument in order to make them sound crazy or to more easily destroy it. So somebody that might be against critical race theory, you might say, wait, you don't believe racism exists? You're against teaching about slavery in schools? We're just trying to teach honest history. I don't see why you're against that unless you're a racist. You don't want to teach about the evils that white people committed in history. You just want to whitewash history. That's what we want. No. Everybody has learned. I mean, what schools have not taught about slavery? What schools have not taught about Jim Crow laws? I educated myself a little more on Black Wall Street, but that's a lot more nuanced. So we've gone through the history of critical race theory, its Marxist origins through. So people want to say, oh, this isn't Marxist, you're being a conspiracy theorist. It's directly Marxist. They claim to be Marxist. They admit to being Marxists. So don't listen to their lies. Ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. Critical race theory, all critical theories will be no different. I'm going to go back to what James Lindsay said at the beginning in the introduction of his book. He said, we should not attempt to cure what we don't understand. And attempting to cure critical race theory, and I'll add all critical theories, is an obligation of every person in this world who wishes to remain free. Red or yellow, black or white, regardless of your color, this will ruin your life. Thank you for watching. If you have questions, post them in the comments. I am happy to defend any of my claims in this. And there's a lot more detail I could get into. This is about as quick as I could make it and still give you an overview of this extremely harmful and destructive ideology, but also give you some hopefully helpful information. Thank you. God bless you. See you later.